All right. So, as you guys hopefully remember, last week we finished our discussion on, well, not last week, last Tuesday, right? We finished with monopolistic competition, and today we're going started with our last market structure, which is oligopoly. Okay. So let's see. We'll talk about some of the characteristics of oligopoly first. So, what is a good thing about oligopoly is that we don't really have to learn any of the demand curves. So, because it's a little bit more complicated than we really can do with AP economics. So we don't do that, but we're gonna learn about something else, which is called the game theory, and that is essentially the only kind of difficult thing with oligopoly. Okay. All right. So characteristics of oligopoly, right? Uh, they have a few large producers. Okay. So oligopoly is essentially a type of market structure that is characterized by a small number of relatively large farms that dominate the industry. Okay. So small number of large farms. That's key. Remember how this is different than monopolistic competition, where it was kind of the other way around. So you had a large number of relatively small farms, and here you have a small number of rather large farms. Okay, um, and the market can be dominated by as few as two farms or as many as 20, and it can still be considered an oligopoly. Okay. With fewer than two farms, obviously, it would be a monopoly because, monopoly is just, one farm. And as the number of farms increase, right, oligopoly, becomes close to a monopolistic competition. But really the key idea here is that there are very few large producers. Okay. So usually what we see with oligopoly is that sometimes the 10 largest farms will often account for over 75% of total sales in any market. Or for some type of oligopolies, the 3 to 4 largest farms will sometimes account for over 90% of the market. So the market share of the 3 or 4 large farms tends to be really large compared to the overall size of the market. So what they have is really a lot of market control. Okay, so they have substantial market control because they are that top 3 or 4 farms tend to be really big compared to the overall market. Okay, so that's why they have a substantial amount of market control. They don't have as much control as a monopoly, as you can imagine. Of course, because for a monopoly they're the only farm in the industry, right? They're the market themselves, so they have all of the power to control supply. So oligopolies don't have as much power as a monopoly, but they definitely have a greater control over price than monopolistically competitive farms, which have a large number of really small farms. Okay, and some examples of oligopoly industries would be the auto industry, cellular phone providers, computers, smartphones, these industries. Okay, and the reason we're going to see is this. So the type of product oligopolies or oligopoly industry sell. Some oligopolies will produce identical products, and while others will produce differentiated products. So it could be both. So there could be they could be differentiated or they could be standardized. So standardized meaning identical, differentiated meaning that there is some difference in the product. So identical product or standardized product, right? So standardized, also meaning this is the same as identical. Um, these type of oligopolies tend to process raw materials, right? So crude oil, steel, they're usually type of goods that are used as inputs by other industries. So, we don't use crude oil or steel, as the end good, sort of, right? We use steels to build something. We use oil, for cars or whatever or not. So there the oligopolies that make identical products, are essentially just processing raw materials that are going to be used as input in other industries. Okay, so aluminum, steel, petroleum, these are the oligopolies that produce identical products. And differentiated products, they tend to focus on consumer goods that satisfy the needs of consumers. So they're going to be consumer goods, right? And examples of these type of oligopolies would be, the automobile industry, because people who we want variety in the type of cars that we see in the market. So and then soft drinks, smartphones, computers. Okay, so these are oligopolies that are producing differentiated products. Computers. And if you look at all of these markets, you will see that that first characteristic is always true. Automobiles, in the USA, I think like Ford, GMC, Chrysler, these three are sort of the top automobile manufacturers. Like 3 or 4 large firms, dominate the industry. Cell phones, like smartphones, for the software for smartphones, it's only either the Apple iOS or the Google's Android, right? So these two are the large. There might be some other ones, I don't even know if there are, but those two dominate the industry. Same with computers. Windows and Windows software for from Microsoft, and then Apple iOS. Those two, for computer softwares. Those two are the only ones that dominate the industry, right? So, which is why it doesn't really matter with oligopoly so much. How many farms there are, even if there are 20 or 30 farms. What matters is if the industry is top heavy, if 3 or 4 large farms are dominating the industry. Okay, any question here, guys?
So there can still be a lot of firms, but it only matters
Yes, so it's not gonna be right. Sorry, Jaime, finish.
If there are very if there are very big firms, but there can be still a lot. But if they're very big firms, it doesn't matter.
I wouldn't say it doesn't matter. So they're not going to be like as many farms as we saw in monopolistic or perfect competition. There definitely isn't going to be as many as that. But what matters here, so remember when we talked about monopolistic competition or perfect competition, we always talked about how they're very small compared to the entire market, right? I don't know if you remember that, but if you recall that, but
Yes.
we kept talking about that. They're very small compared to the entire market. So in terms of how much they're producing, like one farm, how much it is producing and how much it is selling, that was very small compared to how much was produced and sold in the entire market. So this is not going to be the case here with those 3 or 4 top farms. They're going to account for maybe even like more than 50% of products that are produced and sold in the market. So sometimes the top 4 will produce or sell almost 90% of the products in the industry. Sometimes it will be 60%, but it will most likely be more than 50%. Okay, so we call that concentration. So we'll talk about that a little bit later, but that is the key takeaway from here. Okay.
One question.
Yeah.
Are you recording this class?
I am. So it's being recorded. Yes. Okay. Then we talk about barriers to entry. So there are barriers to entry in the oligopoly market. So it's difficult, but it's not impossible as it was with monopoly to enter this market. So the most common barriers to entry include like patents, resource ownership, and brand name recognition, brand, all these other, like startup costs, they tend to be really high. So it's not impossible to enter an oligopoly market, even though these kind of barriers to entry, but it is really fairly difficult to enter the market. If it was really easy, right, it wouldn't be dominated by a few large farms. So these large farms, they probably have all of these things working for them. They have patents, for their products. They have resource ownerships. They have brand names, loyalty from customers that they have created over the years. They, probably paid a high startup cost to get started with. So, to overcome all these barriers for a new farm is rather difficult, although it's not impossible. Okay.
So there is long run economic profit.
So we don't really like get into that with oligopoly either. So yeah, that is something that would be like for discussion for, I guess, higher economic classes. But with oligopoly, we don't really get into that either. Okay.
Okay.
All right. So the other final characteristic of oligopoly that we're going to discuss is this thing about mutual interdependence. Okay, so because there are a large number of there's a small number of relatively large farms that dominate this industry, and they all have substantial amount of market control. Means that the relative the interdependence among farms is sort of a key feature of oligopoly. Okay, so the action by interdependence we mean that the action of one farm is likely to affect the others. Okay, so each oligopolistic farm, they have to keep a close eye on the activities of the other farms in the industry. Okay, because the decision that one farm makes regarding their prices will invariably affect the others, and they're gonna be this farm that made that choice to change their price are gonna be affected by their rivals too. So it's sort of like the competition of or interdependence among oligopoly farms. You can sort of compare that to a game, right, or in like an athletic contest almost, because one team's success, right, in a game, it depends not only on how well you're playing, but also if the but also on the action of your competitor. So you can play well, but if they're playing equally well, you're not likely to win the game. But you can win if they're not doing as well as you, right? So that way, that is sort of the interdependence portion of oligopoly that it matters. What you do is not enough, because you also have to sort of check and keep a close eye on how your competitors are reacting to this action that you took. Okay. Then we talk about something called concentration ratio with oligopolies. Okay, so concentration ratio, economists, they try to sort of gauge how much market share is held by a certain number of farms using this number. Okay, so it really sort of indicates the degree of competition in oligopoly industry. Okay, and these numbers sort of can range from 0% to 100%. Okay, so what we are really getting here is, or what the concentration ratio really tells us, it's sort of the fraction of total industry activity. So it's the fraction of total industry activity accounted for by the four, sometimes when we're talking about concentration ratio, right, we can either go with 4 largest farms in the industry or 8. So we can see both, sometimes it's 4, sometimes it's 8. So for 8 largest farms in the market. Okay, so if I tell you, for example, the 4 farm concentration ratio is 85, it means that the top 4 farms in the industry combined, they hold 85% of the market share. Okay, if I had told you it was like rather an 8 farm concentration ratio of 85%, it would only mean that the top 8 farms in the industry combine for 85% of the market share. Okay. So this really happens. This kind of concentration is not so much of an issue with monopoly, right? Because monopoly has only 1 farm, so that this concentration ratio, if this were a monopoly, it would be 100%, right? So which means that there is no competition. So the higher the number, the less competition there is in an industry. Do you understand that part?
Yes.
Okay, so if it's closer to 100, it means you're getting closer to a monopoly. So of course, there is really not much of a competition or competition at all. But yeah, so it's really not so much of an issue with with monopoly. It's 100%, but it's not really so much of an issue with perfect competition or monopolistic competition, because there we saw that there were so many number of small farms, and then their overall share of the market was really small. It is only with oligopoly that we see that this issue of concentration ratio sort of come up. Government officials will look at this number, if there are ever any allegations that some oligopolies are behaving like a monopoly, so they'll quickly check to see what the concentration ratio is, if it's close to 100%, or if it's more like a oligopoly or not. So this is it's just a quick way to check what type, if there is any competition in the industry or not, if somebody is trying to behave like a monopoly. Because it's this is how the concentration ratio is sometimes used. And like I mentioned here, an oligopoly is apparent when the top 5 farms in the market account for more than 60% of the total market. It could be sales or production, right, according to concentration ratio. So if the top 5 farms in the market they account for more than 60% of market sales, you would call them an oligopoly. And then, okay. All right. So behavior of oligopoly. Okay. So oligopoly farms can choose to make their own individual pricing decisions, and we call that something which is known as non-collusion. Or they can also meet with their rivals to make pricing decisions, and we call that collusion. Okay, so collusion and non-collusion are the 2 ways that an oligopoly can sort of make their pricing decisions. So let's see what those 2 are.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So collusion is illegal. So why?
Yes.
But firms do meet up to make pricing decisions
because
in
they
some
wanna
market.
yes, it's definitely illegal, so they don't do it, they try to do it secretly, right? They're not gonna do it out in the open, but there are lots of benefits for them to try to act, to try to collude, because then they can sort of act like a monopoly. Okay, so
Okay.
they're basically gonna do it, sort of secretively. I don't really know the mechanism for how they do it, but like on the surface they're gonna act like they're making decisions independently, they're not colluding, but on the inside, they're gonna meet secretly and tell each other, that this is how much you should produce, this is how much I will produce. They can sort of set price, they can decide how much they're going to produce, and that way they can actually act like a monopoly.
Okay.
So this is collusions where two or more farms secretly agree to control price, production, or other aspects of the market. Okay. With collusions, right, they remain legally independent and autonomous, right? So they're self-regulated, they're legally, that's the way it seems, that they're independent of each other and they're not colluding, but secretly, on the inside they're actually benefiting from cooperation. Okay. In effect, they sort of operate as if they were one farm, right? They act as if they were a monopoly, and by acting like a monopoly, they can set a monopoly price, they can produce a monopoly quantity, right? So remember that the monopoly price and monopoly price is a higher, monopoly quantity is lower. So they will essentially, right, they're going to limit the output and they're going to charge a higher price, and they're going to, if they're both doing the same thing, right, they don't really have this fear that which happens with non-collusion, as we will see in a minute in the next slide. What happens with if you are not colluding with each other. If you are colluding, right, you are making formal agreements that we're going to do the same thing, right? You and I are going to do the same thing essentially, right? So we're going to charge this price, we're going to produce this much, you're going to produce this much, I'm going to produce this much, and then if it's only the two of us, then people really don't have a choice but to buy from both of us, right? So they can sort of behave as inefficiently as a monopoly by colluding. Okay. And explicit collusive behavior is illegal, at least in the US. Okay. So they do it sort of secretively. So sometimes collusive oligopolies will form something called a cartel, which is a group of farms that create a formal agreement not to compete with each other. Okay. And the most I guess in the US, right, we said that collusion is illegal and it's kept a secret, but some collusive agreements are anything but secret. So the most well-known example of this is is OPEC countries, or does anybody know what the what OPEC is? Hello?
I don't know.
Okay, so OPEC stands for the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Okay, so it's actually, I think now it's a group of 15 countries, such as like Iran, Iraq, I think Libya, a lot of other countries in like some countries in Africa, some countries in the Middle East, like Angola, some other, very oil-rich countries. So together, these 15 countries, they own 80% of the world's oil reserve. So as you can see, they sort of have this, monopoly over, oil production almost, right? Because, together they own 81% of the oil, and they produce almost 44% of the world's oil. So they together, they own 81% of the oil reserve, and then they will, their share, is like 44% of the world's oil production. So what these countries do, so like we mentioned, the cartels are, explicit cartels are illegal, but everybody sort of knows this about the OPEC countries. They're anything but a secret. They're sort of like an open, formal, collusive agreement that these 15 countries have made with each other to control price and production of oil. Okay, so they want to sort of avoid the fluctuations that happen in world economy. So they formally meet and agree on a price of oil, and how much each country is going to produce, and invariably they this way they can sort of help each other, right, by not competing with each other. So, but then there are some problems with collusive behavior, though. There is sometimes, there can be difficulty in arriving at a mutually acceptable agreement to restrict output, like how much you're going to produce, how much I'm going to produce. It's a group of 15 countries, as you can imagine. Everybody has their own agenda, so sometimes it can be very difficult for them to reach, a negotiation. Also, there can be cheating. Even though you said you're going to produce this much, but you produce more, or you said you're going to set this price, but then you end up charging a higher price, because there's really not an effective, I guess, punishment mechanism. It's sort of like a formal agreement, but I don't think nothing much happens if you don't abide by it. Maybe you are going to be left out of the cartel or something, but it's a potential problem. Right. Also, if there are entry of new farms, you lose, this sort of monopoly power that you have, by controlling 81% of the world's oil reserve, and you lose that monopoly profit. Okay. So these are sort of the problems with collusive behavior. Even though there are benefits, there are also some issues.
I have a question.
Yeah, Jaime?
So, for the problem is that these firms are trying to act as monopolies, or is it that they are, like it's illegal? Or
It's illegal. It's of course illegal. In the U.S., it is illegal, but these countries, they're not in the U.S. So I guess they can do that, out in the open. They sort of, but it's a problem, for them, if they lose their monopoly power. But it's.
Why is it illegal?
Sorry.
Why is it illegal?
Because you're not really, you're not going to be benefiting consumers, by being a monopoly is not a good thing for society, because you charge a higher price, and you produce less than the socially optimal quantity. So society wants them to produce more, but they produce less, and then they can charge a higher price. So by colluding, they can act like a monopoly, and society, we don't really like. So there are benefits to monopoly, but the government usually tries to curtail monopolies, because if they have too much power, they're sort of deviating from this socially optimal quantity and like the price. So that's why the government always tries to regulate monopolies. We have all these laws in place that tries to break up monopolies, or tries to always keep them in check. So check, right? So by colluding, you can become a monopoly, and that's really not great for consumers and society overall. Okay, does that answer your question? Hello?
Yes.
Okay, great. Jaime, did you have any more question?
No, thank you. But thank you for answering.
Okay. All right. So then the other part of the behavior that oligopolies can exhibit is the non-collusive behavior. So this is, if you don't collude, right? If you are not, in agreement with your rival, you haven't like met in secret and decided, how much to produce, how much to um, charge, right, for price. So you don't have any agreement with your competitor, but then you kind of have to worry about what your rivals do. So that is non-collusive behavior. And the demand curve for a non-collusive oligopoly farm sort of depends on the reaction of their rivals. So this is why we don't like do the I guess show the demand curve in AP economics, because it's like a kinked demand curve. It's sorry, not like this, but it's like something like this. The two demand curves, they have different slopes, and it's more than what we want to do in this class, I suppose. So we don't really do this, but then this is what the demand curve for a non-collusive oligopoly would look like. But then what so this is how they sort of have to watch out, and keep and watch on what their competitor is doing. So let's say we have two farms, farm A and farm B. Okay, so if farm A decides to raise the price for its product, okay, so farm B has two options. Okay, they can either raise the price as well. So if their competitor is raising price, they can raise the price, or they can maintain the price that they had. Okay, so they can maintain their own price. So if they both raise their prices, this is what will happen, right? So they would both enjoy an increase in profit. Okay, because now the price is higher, so of course their total revenue is going to be higher. So then they can both enjoy a modest increase in profit. But let's say if farm A raised their price, but then farm B didn't, they maintained their price at it as it was. So people are obviously gonna go buy from the farm. If the product is not, they're differentiated, but it's not like they're unique, right? So you can still buy something close from the competitive farm. So farm B, if they maintain their old price, which is lower than farm A's current price, so they would enjoy a large increase in profits, because they would be able to sell more. But farm A would lose, they would be making losses, right? They would be making their market share, because some of their customers are now going to shop with farm B, which has a lower price. And then let's say if farm A, in another example, if farm A decided to lower its prices, and farm B also decide to lower their prices, by seeing, what farm A is doing. So both farms are now going to earn less profit than before, right? Because now they have both lowered their profit, and, their profit is going down. But if farm A decided to lower their price and farm B maintained their price, right? In this example, because farm B's price is now higher, and they didn't lower their price like farm A, so farm B would now lose their market share, and farm A would enjoy an increase in profit. So this is sort of how we call this a game, right? So there you kind of have to watch out what your rival is doing. And so next week in class we'll actually take a look at this thing called a game theory. So it's sort of like a model of strategic decision making based on how your competitor is behaving. So we'll take a look at this kind of matrix, and this is the only sort of it's not difficult, but once you get your head around it. But this is what we're going to take a look at. And you can be sure that something like this is either going to show up on the multiple choice portion or the free response. And so we'll really have to make sure we understand it well. So this is what we call a game, where you have to, one person has one strategy, and then the other person, based on what the other person is doing, what kind of strategy they're taking, your decision, or you have something to gain or lose. Okay, any question?
So it is like chess.
I guess, yeah, you could say that. Yes. So you definitely have to watch out for your opponent, like anticipate their behavior, and yeah. Okay, any question, guys? Hello?
No, I'm good.
Okay, so yeah, we are past 2:50, so we're gonna finish this game theory and also oligopoly lecture on next Tuesday, hopefully. So make sure to do some review, before you come to class on Tuesday, just to refresh your memory a little. Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye.
See you
Thank you.
guys. Bye bye.